I am who I am because it's been like Yun Chun-Li, grandfather, one in a billion ancestor. I need to define my space, define my face in this ancestral embrace that is skin tight, but my skin fits me just right. They're all there, my ancestral throne, for I am, we are, lifetimes infinite, billion strong.
Hi everyone, welcome to Mind Your Margins, a podcast that seeks to foster a space where it's humanly possible to make humanity possible. My name is Michelle Myers, and I'm going to try my best to help us navigate through topics about marginalized identities and prioritizing the perspectives of people who may feel invisible or silenced or ignored or erased. Also, I want to acknowledge that these discussions are really difficult, but I'm hoping that through these conversations, we can claim space for understanding and compassion. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this episode today. But before I get into today's topic, as I do at the beginning of every episode, I'm going to share a land acknowledgement statement. I call out to the ancestors of the native peoples of this land in the hopes that by honoring them, I also honor my mother and my father, who are now ancestors, and through them, connect to my Korean ancestors and the land of my birth. I hope that you will reflect on the words as I speak them. I acknowledge that the land on which I live and work are the ancestral lands of the Lenni Lenape people, whose presence and resilience in New Jersey, Eastern Pennsylvania, and Delaware continue to this day. I recognize that the place where I recorded this podcast also sits on the unceded homeland of the Lenape people. I and my listeners take this opportunity to honor the original caretakers of this land and recognize the histories of land theft, violence, erasure, and oppression that has brought ourselves here. We are grateful to be guests in these lands and commit to solidarity in the struggle for Indigenous sovereignty. This land acknowledgement does not correct the wrongs committed against the Lenape or any of the other First Nation peoples across this continent, but through it, I hope to remind myself and my listeners of our connections and indebtedness to the Indigenous people of this land, and especially of New Jersey, Eastern Pennsylvania, and Delaware. Saying their names and learning their histories call them into our consciousness and awareness. Thank you very much for listening to that land acknowledgement statement. In the last episode, I had mentioned that I have a student this semester who identifies as biracial, as Native American and African American. And I'm bringing her up again because one of the things I really admire about her is how openly and proudly she talks about being mixed race. There's no hesitation, no apology in how she claims her identity. And because of that, her classmates respect her deeply. They've actually told her that several times throughout the semester. And I find that especially powerful because while many Native people identify as multiracial, there are also very real pressures around how identity gets defined and recognized within tribal nations. And a lot of that is tied to blood quantum requirements. So if you've never heard of blood quantum requirements, it's a system that assigns a fraction to a Native American person's identity, literally measuring how quote unquote Native they are based on their ancestry. And this system is not something that originated within Indigenous communities themselves, but rather something that was imposed by the U.S. government as a way to regulate and ultimately limit who could claim tribal citizenship. And over time, it's created this pressure for people to prove that they are enough to belong, enough to be recognized, enough to be counted in terms of being seen as indigenous by the United States government. And we'll leave a couple of links to resources about the blood quantum system and its impact on Native identity on the episode description page in case you want to learn more. So with the blood quantum system, identity becomes something that has to be documented or calculated or proven. And over time, that has created layers of scrutiny about Native American identity, not just from institutions, but sometimes from within the communities themselves. For example, there are ongoing conversations within First Nation communities about pretendians, people who falsely claim Native identity, which has made questions of authenticity even more charged. And at the same time, there are people who do have Native ancestry, but are told it's too distant or not, quote unquote, enough to claim. So you end up with this complicated tension where identity isn't just about lived experience or connection. It's also shaped by systems of validation and of doubt. And that's part of why my students' pride in being mixed race feels so meaningful to me. The way she claims herself, clearly, confidently, pushes against all that. So seeing the pride that this student has in her mixed race identity has led me to reflect on my own journey. Because I didn't grow up feeling that kind of pride or ease or certainty in my mixed race identity. I grew up feeling like I had to explain it or defend it or sometimes even downplay parts of it depending on who I was around. And so when I see someone move through the world with that level of clarity and self-assurance, it feels inspiring, but also, if I'm being honest, a little confronting, because it makes me ask myself, what would it have looked like if I had felt that way earlier in my life too? And it also brings me back to something I've been thinking about more and more, that even though more people today identify as multiracial, society still doesn't always create the space for us to exist without question. People still uphold systems and make assumptions that pressure mixed race people to prove who we are rather than simply accepting us as we are. So I wanted to start here with my student because in many ways she represents both the progress we've made and the work that still needs to be done. And all of this brings me to today's episode. In the previous episode, which was episode 11, What 25 Years of Yellow Rage Has Taught Me About Anger, Part 1, Anger Outright. In that episode, I began reflecting on what I've learned after more than a quarter century of being part of Yellow Rage. And in that episode, I started at the beginning, when Yellow Rage was still a trio, and we were just beginning to write and perform together, still figuring out what it meant to speak openly about race and gender, identity and belonging. But in this episode, I want to talk about how my anger has always been rooted in something very personal, which is the way I've been treated as a mixed race Korean American woman. Like I alluded to earlier, what's interesting and sometimes frustrating is that we're living in a moment where more and more people identify as multiracial. Demographically, the numbers keep growing, right? You see more mixed families, more mixed kids, and yet, even with that visibility, multiracial people are still shut out of public conversations about identity. We're still pressured to compress ourselves into something simpler for other people's comfort. We're still expected to pick a side or explain ourselves or justify the identities we claim, especially if we quote unquote look racially ambiguous. In other words, even though there are more of us now, a space for us hasn't necessarily grown in ways that matter. People still look at our faces and decide who we are before we ever open our mouths. They still treat identity like something that can be measured by skin tone, by last name, by culture, by language, by how closely we resemble whatever version of quote-unquote authentic they carry in their heads. And if we don't match that expectation, then suddenly these other people think they have the right to define our identity for us. I can't even begin to describe for you the anger rising inside me right now when I think about all the times when people ask me, "What are you?" and I say, "I'm Korean American," and they say, "No, you're not," or "You don't look Korean." And I want to say, "Who the fuck are you to question me? What the fuck do you think you know about what being Korean looks like?" Which is basically how my part of Listen Asshole starts, right? It pisses me off when people think they somehow have the right to question my identity, like it's up to them whether my identity is negotiable or suspect or open for debate. For people who are multiracial, that kind of scrutiny puts us in a mindset where we're constantly waiting for the hammer to drop on our heads. That's how it feels to me anyway. We learn very early that other people are reading us and categorizing us and trying to push a feeling of shame onto us that would relegate us into boxes that were always meant to oppress us and diminish our sense of self-worth. And so part of what I want to do in this episode is talk even more honestly about what all that feels like, about what it does to mixed race people over time. Because when you grow up being questioned, being told implicitly or explicitly that you're not quite enough of one thing or another just based upon how another person is judging your looks, it shapes the way you move through the world. It shapes the way you understand belonging. And it shapes the anger you carry. For me, that anger didn't come out of nowhere. It grew out of years of being told in both small and large ways that I didn't fully belong anywhere. And of course, many of the poems that I've written and performed as part of Yellow Rage and as a solo artist were born directly out of that feeling. The need to claim space in a world that kept trying to impose a definition on me of who I was. So throughout my life, constantly finding myself pushed into a position to justify and defend my identity gave seed to my anger. It's at the very heart of my anger. Growing up biracial meant that I spent much of my childhood feeling like I didn't fully belong anywhere. Like when I started attending Catholic school in the 2nd grade, I was called racial slurs. Kids sang ching chong songs at me while making slanty eyes. They told me to go back to China even though I was born in South Korea. But at the same time, I didn't feel fully connected to my Korean heritage either. My mother and father met while my dad was stationed near Seoul, South Korea in the late 60s and early 70s. They got married in 1971, and when my dad was restationed in the United States in November of 1972, I was about 8 months old. So that's how old I was when we came to the United States. And then my parents left me with my grandmother, my dad's mom, in New Jersey while they got settled in Alexandria, Louisiana, which is where my dad had been restationed and is where my brother was eventually born. But by the time they came back to New Jersey to get me, to bring me to Louisiana, I was already talking in English. So my mom decided not to speak Korean to my brother and me because she thought it would be better for us growing up in America. And when I was a teenager, I asked her why she decided not to speak Korean to us. And she said she didn't want us to become confused. And she also thought it would be better for us in school. She also told me something that stayed with me and bothered me for years. She said that if I had grown up in Korea, I would have been bullied there too because I was mixed, and that Korean people would never fully see me or treat me as Korean. Looking back now, I understand that my mother was trying to protect us in the only way she knew how. But that decision also had consequences, right? It cut us off from language, from some aspects of our culture, and from a deeper connection to our identity. So later in life, when people questioned my identity, I didn't always have the grounding or confidence to push back because I couldn't always understand Korean or speak Korean. I couldn't fall back on language as a marker of belonging. And even though I ate Korean food and knew a lot about Korean culture, I couldn't completely rely on cultural fluency to ground myself either. So that absence around language became its own kind of wound, one that made me feel as if I constantly had to prove something about who I was. Even now, when I meet other Koreans or Korean Americans, I sometimes feel a sense of dread. Like, I immediately start wondering how they're going to judge me. It's just programmed into me now. Often when someone introduces me to another Korean American, especially if this person doesn't know me from Yellow Rage, and they say, "Oh, Michelle is Korean too," I expect to see this look of surprise on the other person's face. I'm looking for that quick flicker of doubt, like they're thinking, "Oh, she doesn't look Korean." Then the person who introduced us might sense the doubt on their face too and try to clarify by saying, "Oh, she's half Korean," which also bothers me because even they feel within themselves they have to justify my identity. And then somewhere early in the conversation with this other Korean person, I find myself trying to slip in almost offensively, "Oh, I only speak toddler Korean." And I realize I say it as a kind of preemptive apology, like I'm trying to soften the judgment before it arrives. And it's a really frustrating feeling to anticipate rejection even in moments that are supposed to be about connection. But I also realize that what I'm doing in those moments is a kind of self-protection mechanism, right? Because if I say it first, if I admit that my Korean is limited, if I explain my background before anyone can question it, then maybe I can control the moment a little bit. Maybe I can soften whatever judgment might come next. Because the judgment is coming. That's a given. So the more I think about it, the more I recognize that this habit has come from years of internalizing the idea that my identity is something that needs to be explained or clarified or defended as a condition for it to be accepted. And that's a pretty fucked up mental and emotional space to be in, especially when you're young. Because when you grow up feeling like you have to prove who you are, it changes the way you enter spaces that should feel familiar and safe. Like for me, instead of arriving with a sense of ease or belonging, I come into many spaces already bracing myself. Like I'm scanning people's faces, listening for cues, trying to anticipate whether I'm about to be welcomed or openly scrutinized. And when that happens often enough to someone, it begins to shape your relationship to your own identity. It makes you question if you'll ever feel a true sense of belonging, or are you doomed to be an outcast for the rest of your life? And for a long time, as a young person, I didn't have the language to articulate that feeling. I just knew that whenever I entered Korean spaces or Asian American spaces in general, I carried this anxiety with me. I worried that someone might ask me something or make a comment that would expose what I didn't know. That someone might hear the way I spoke or notice that I didn't understand or couldn't say certain things in Korean and decide that I wasn't really Korean after all. And the painful irony in that is the very community I longed to feel closer to was oftentimes the place where I felt the most alienated. And what I've come to understand over the years is how, in general, we're taught to think of race and culture as something measurable by language, by appearance, by how closely someone matches an imagined idea of authenticity. But for many of us, especially those of us who are mixed race or come from multiple cultural backgrounds, identity is way more complicated than that. It's shaped by history, by migration, by family decisions made long before we were old enough to understand their consequences. And most of all, our identity, our entire being, really, hinges on circumstances beyond our control, like two people of different so-called races and sometimes different cultures who had a child together, and we, the mixed race children, didn't choose that, but somehow we're the ones punished for it. And yet those complexities are rarely acknowledged in everyday interactions. Instead, the burden often falls on the person who is seen as quote-unquote different to explain ourselves, to translate our own existence into something other people can understand and accept, to make other people comfortable with who we are at a steep price to our own sense of self. That's part of what makes those kinds of moments so exhausting. Not just the judgment I dreaded, but the constant sense that I had to narrate my own legitimacy. Looking back now, I can see how those experiences planted seeds of anger in me long before I ever stepped onto a stage as a poet. Because we're talking about experiences I've had since I was a child. The first time I remember feeling ashamed for being mixed, I was about 5 years old. It was the 4th of July or some kind of summer family gathering on the white side of my family. Some relatives were sitting around the kitchen table playing cards. They were laughing and drinking beer. And I had been outside playing, so I came inside and went to the kitchen all hot and sweaty and thirsty. I walked up to the table where they were playing cards and asked if I could have something to drink. All the adults looked at me for a moment, and then one of them said, "You know what you are? You're a half-breed, a mutt." And then they waved their hand at me like I should go away. And of course, as a 5-year-old, I didn't really understand the meaning of those words yet, but I understood the feeling behind them. I remember feeling confused and embarrassed and ashamed, like something about me was suddenly wrong. That was the first time anyone said something racist to me, and it was someone in my own family. My home was not a safe space for me growing up. And even though I was very young when it happened, I can remember it like it was yesterday. So you can see how it stayed with me for my entire life. And even though I grew up around my white relatives, I never thought of myself as white. Never. I always saw myself as Korean. Even though my mom didn't speak Korean to my brother and me, she did speak Korean around us, to other Korean people, and to family on the phone. So I always knew Korean when I heard it. Plus, we ate Korean food every day. My mom didn't really like American food. She thought it was too fatty or too rich or too sweet. So I always saw myself as Korean. And like I mentioned earlier, when I started Catholic school in the 2nd grade, the white kids made sure I understood that they saw me as different too, but in a bad way. They called me chink. They sang ching chong songs. I felt like an outsider growing up, and I struggled to make friends from about 2nd grade to 8th grade because I was seen as that quote unquote Oriental girl whose mom spoke with an accent and who ate weird food. So in terms of how I saw my own identity, from the moment I started school until I graduated high school, I was always the Oriental girl. My nickname in high school was Hung Chow. It wasn't until I got to college that I started to be read as quote unquote white. And that was by other Asian American students. So that was very confusing for me. But anyway, as a kid, things began to shift when I transferred from Catholic school to a public high school. And for the first time, I started to find community, and that was among other teenage girls who identified as African American. So there were only 2 Asian American students in my entire high school, me and another mixed race girl who was Japanese American. And we avoided each other like the plague. I can't even begin to tell you how annoying it was for me when people called me by her name. So again, not only did I feel like an outsider, but when people mistook me for her, I felt like people were saying all Asian people look the same when she and I looked nothing alike. But then one day, a group of African American girls at my school basically decided that I belonged with them. Literally, that's what happened. I was a varsity cheerleader and I was outside during practice going over our routines by myself. And they saw me and said, "Why is it every time we see you, you're by yourself? You know what? You're coming with us." And just like that, they pulled me in. And they became like sisters to me. They never questioned me or my identity. From day one, they accepted that I was Korean American. Them doing that mattered more to me than they probably realized at the time. Being claimed, being welcomed like that, changed the way I saw myself. It gave me a sense of belonging that I hadn't felt before. And looking back now, I think part of what made that acceptance so powerful was how uncomplicated it was. There was no interrogation, no moment where I had to explain myself or prove something about who I was. They didn't ask me how Korean I was or whether I spoke the language or whether I had grown up eating certain foods. They didn't measure my identity against some imagined standard of authenticity. They simply made space for me and said, in their own way, "You're with us." And when you've spent a lot of time feeling like you're being scrutinized, like people are constantly going, "What are you? What are you? What are you?" That kind of unconditional acceptance can feel almost surreal. It removes the pressure to perform your identity for other people. Instead of constantly thinking about how you're being perceived, you can finally relax into just being yourself. And that was a gift. They let me just be me. I've also come to understand that their acceptance didn't happen in a vacuum. There's a long and complex history within African American communities around mixed race identity. One that's been shaped by the legacy of slavery, where racial mixing was often the result of violence, coercion, and also survival. And out of that history came the idea of the quote unquote one drop rule. This belief perpetuated by white people that even one drop of Black ancestry made you Black. It meant that even people who looked white could still be classified as Black and subjected to enslavement and systemic oppression. So race in that context wasn't about appearance alone. It was about power, control, and maintaining a system of white supremacy. And what's so hypocritical is how different that is from other systems of racial classification that white people made up, like the blood quantum standards imposed on Native American communities by the US government that I had mentioned earlier, where identity is restricted rather than expanded, where you have to prove that you are indigenous enough, measured in the fractions. So the quote unquote one drop system forced people in. And the fractions of the blood quantum system pushes people out. But both reveal how arbitrary and manipulative these ideas of race really are. I also think on some level, within an African American consciousness, that the history of slavery and the one drop rule creates a different kind of cultural awareness. A recognition that identity isn't always neat or easily defined, and that people's stories are often more complicated than what you can see. And maybe that's part of why, when those girls welcomed me, there wasn't this impulse to measure me or verify me before letting me in. There was more of an openness and awareness of what it feels like to move through the world carrying other people's assumptions about who you are. And that shared awareness created a kind of empathy that didn't require a lot of explanation. It wasn't that our experiences were exactly the same, but there was enough overlap in how we were being seen and misseen that it created a bridge between us. In many ways, that early experience shaped how I later understood community. It showed me that belonging doesn't always come from shared ethnicity or cultural background. Sometimes it comes from shared experiences of marginalization, from recognizing pieces of your own struggle in someone else's story. That's part of what made those friendships so meaningful to me. They were rooted in recognition rather than suspicion. And those girls probably thought they were just inviting another teenage girl to hang out. But in reality, they were giving me something much bigger, a model of what it feels like to be welcomed without having to justify my existence first. And that sense of connection among African American people continued when I went to college and became involved with the EOF MAP program, which stands for Educational Opportunity Fund and Minority Achievement Program, at Glassboro State College, which is now Rowan University. It was there that I began to develop a deeper political consciousness around my racial identity. Since most of the students who came through EOF were African American history was prioritized for students and constantly being discussed by program counselors. I remember when I first read the autobiography of Malcolm X for one of our Sunday excursion programs and having this powerful realization. Here was a Black man teaching me American history, because in his autobiography, he talks about colonialism and imperialism and the global struggles of people of color in America, in Africa, in Asia, in ways I had never encountered in school up until that time. That moment expanded my understanding of solidarity and shared struggle. It made me see how the experiences of different communities were connected. It's the reason why I wanted to specialize in Asian American literature and Asian American studies in grad school. Malcolm X is the one who inspired me to do that. And then this led me on a path which eventually brought me to the Asian Arts Initiative, where I met Katsi and Sepna, and Yellow Rage was born. And even though I felt completely welcomed at Asian Arts Initiative, as I began reclaiming pride in being Korean American through my spoken word poetry, and Katsi and I gained more visibility and went on performance tours, being biracial complicated things for me. I mean, I can honestly say that now, having been part of Yellow Rage for over 25 years, I don't get questioned as much because my visibility and name association with Yellow Rage gets me in the door in Asian American spaces without any resistance. But back then, in the early years of Yellow Rage, the more I tried to claim my identity as Korean American, the more I found it being questioned. And again, mostly by other Asians and Asian Americans. One moment in particular still makes me so angry when I think about it. So sometime during our first few years touring as Yellow Rage, Katsi and I were performing at Drexel University in Philadelphia. And when Katsi was performing her solo poems during our set, a group of guys in the audience started heckling her. When she came off stage, Katsi told me she thought they were Thai because she could hear them insulting her in Thai. As soon as Katsi told me about this, I became really angry because it was bad enough that we dealt with sexism in general as women poets, but hearing that the hostility might be coming from within our own community made me go, what the fuck? What kind of shit is this? So after the show, I went down into the audience and confronted this group of young Asian American men. And I asked them why they heckled Katsi when we were out there fighting for our voices, for Asian American voices to be heard. But instead of responding to my question, one of the guys just looked at me and asked, "You're Korean?" Then he held his arm next to mine, comparing our skin tones, and said, "You're not Korean, you're white." and something in me just snapped. I was so angry that I lunged at him and told him I was going to kick him in his mouth. And I said that because at the time I was practicing Tang Sudo and I was doing all these roundhouse kicks and side kicks and stuff. And I went after him so hard, people had to physically hold me back. And his friends kept saying over and over, "Oh, he's sorry, he's sorry." And they pulled him away. For me, that moment was about intra-ethnic racism, about erasure and silencing and sexism and being told outright that I wasn't accepted by people from within my own community. Over the years, because of my visibility with Yellow Rage as a spoken word poet, many biracial and multiracial Asian Americans have approached me after performances to share their own experiences, and their stories are often so heartbreaking. One time, Katsy and I were performing at Penn State in Erie, Pennsylvania, and I remember two sisters who came up to me after our show. They told me they were half Japanese and half white, and how important it was for them to see and hear me claiming my right to be Asian American. And then they broke down in tears, explaining that an Asian American student organization on their campus wouldn't let them join because the group members dismissed them as quote unquote white girls. It really broke my heart to hear their story because I had been through the same thing. And here it was happening again to other mixed race Asian Americans. Another time, when I was performing solo in Cambridge near Boston, a young man who identified as biracial Korean American told me how he had felt rejected by the Korean American community for his entire life and how he was planning a trip to South Korea, hoping that reconnecting with family and immersing himself in the language might help him reclaim that part of himself. And I'm sure you can hear it in my voice. Just retelling these stories of fucked up Asians who say ignorant shit to mixed Asian Americans on purpose to make us feel so bad about ourselves pisses me off to no end. Even in my own classrooms, I hear students wrestling with these questions. My biracial Asian American students over the years have told me how they're constantly scrutinized for how quote unquote Asian they look. When I was teaching Asian American Studies courses at Temple University about 10 years ago, a student once told me she felt like that viral dress from the internet. Do you remember that dress people argued about online like 10 years ago? Was it blue or was it black? She said sometimes she felt like people were asking the same question about her identity. Was she Asian or not Asian? Hearing these stories over the years reminds me that the struggles I experienced growing up haven't disappeared. They've just taken on new forms. And these stories also remind me that racial identity is far more complex than most people acknowledge. For people who identify as multiracial, belonging is never a given, and yet the stories of biracial and multiracial people are often missing from broader conversations about race. Opening space for those stories is critical, not only to build understanding across communities, but also to help people, especially young mixed-race people of color, develop a sense of self-love and confidence. And after 25 years of performing, teaching, and speaking about these issues, I've come to understand that the anger I've carried for so long helped me survive. It helped me speak. It helped me claim space in rooms where I was being misread or dismissed. But what I'm also learning now is that survival is not the same as belonging. And the tools that helped me survive aren't always the same ones that'll help me to connect. Yeah, anger gave me language. It gave me clarity. It gave me the courage to speak up about what I've experienced and say, fuck you to the people who disrespect me. And I don't regret that, not for a second. but I'm also asking myself what it means to move beyond only speaking from anger and to start speaking more fully from the stories underneath it. The stories about longing, about confusion, about wanting to be seen without having to prove anything first. Because behind every moment of anger I've written about, every poem, every performance, there's a story about trying to understand where I belong, about trying to hold multiple truths at once, about trying to make sense of an identity that other people have often tried to simplify or define for me. And I think that's the work I'm still doing. Not just naming what made me angry or what caused me pain, but creating space for something else to happen, for conversation, for recognition, for people to see themselves in these stories and maybe feel a little less alone. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that being seen shouldn't require proof. Belonging shouldn't feel like a test. And identity shouldn't be something that other people get to decide for you. So what I'm trying to do in this episode is open something up. Open up space for more honest conversations about what it means to live between identities. Open up space for stories that haven't always been told out loud. Open up space for all of us to listen a little more carefully to each other. And what I hope that people are hearing in what I'm saying is that as a mixed race person who's been walking this earth for 54 years, I'm not here to pass anyone's test. I'm here to live in my full identity, on my terms, and in my whole truth. And this is where I'll end this episode. So since I have so much to say about being mixed race, the next episode will be a continuation of this topic. What 25 years of being part of Yellow Rage has taught me about my anger around mixed race identity, specifically how I'm reclaiming mixed race pride. And Myung and I are still hoping to get these episodes out once a month this year. So before we close out, I wanted to share really quickly that a show I'm watching right now is the K-drama When Life Gives You Tangerines. I'm on the final episode, but I had to take a pause on it because it's just so sad and it hit too close to home for me. And really, I've cried almost every episode, but definitely the last episode has been too hard for me to get through. And there's so much to talk about overall in terms of this show, and hopefully I can devote some time to it in another episode. But what I find really inspiring about this show is that since it starts off set on Jeju-do or Jeju Island, the show has this very strong feminist undercurrent at the same time that it humanizes and even celebrates working class Koreans. And I find that really refreshing, especially because those are stories we don't always get to see centered with that kind of care and depth in K-dramas. Watching it has reminded me how powerful it is when people's lives, especially working class lives and women's lives, marginalized lives, are treated as worthy of attention, as full of complexity, and as deserving of tenderness. Not simplified, not overlooked, just fully seen. And I think in a lot of ways that connects back to everything I've been talking about in this episode. Because at the core of it, this work, whether it's poetry, storytelling, or even the shows we choose to watch, it's about expanding who gets to be visible, who gets to be heard, and who gets to live a life that's true to the very essence of their soul. So if you're watching When Life Gives You Tangerines, or if you end up watching it, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Finally, I wanted to share a quick update on my debut middle grade novel, Talk Me a Story About Moon Rabbit. It's now in the interior design stage, which feels both exciting and a little surreal. But I should know more about the release date in the next couple of months, and I'm really looking forward to starting to share more about it with all of you. And if you're on Facebook, I recently created a public page, which is called Michelle Myers Author Poet, and I'm planning to be more active there in the next month or so, and would love for you to follow along as I share updates, reflections, and more about the book as it moves closer to publication. Thank you very much for listening. Myung and I are so grateful to you for spending this time with us and sharing space. We hope you'll tune in for our next episode. And if you know anyone who you think would be interested in listening to our podcast, Myung and I hope that you'll share it with them. If you'd like to contact Myung and me, you can reach out to us via email at mindyourmargins@gmail.com and on Facebook and Instagram. I can also be reached at michellemyerscontact@gmail.com. Myung and I hope that you'll subscribe to Mind Your Margins so you'll be notified when a new episode is posted. I appreciate you for listening, for reflecting alongside me, and for being part of this space where we're all trying to live a little more thoughtfully and intentionally. Until we share space again, please be mindful of yourself and mindful of others. Take good care.
I am who I am because it's been like Chun-Li. Grandfather, one in a billion ancestor. I need to find my space, to find my face in this ancestral embrace that is skin tight, but my skin fits me just right. They're all there, my ancestral throne, for I am, we are, lifetimes infinite, billion strong.